Hey astrology lovers, I'm Mihas, your astrologer, and I'm going to talk about the astrology of the year 2020. 2020 has been an unprecedented year for much of the world. The pandemic has slowed down the economy and challenged our collective health as well. So how does astrology help us to understand the events of this year? Ever since I began studying astrology, I've heard about the Saturn Pluto conjunction happening in January of 2020. I made some videos with my mentor, Jame Kahl-Miller, about this transit back in November of 2019. You can find them in the links below. Now, this is an historic conjunction because it only happens about every 40 years, so we can only really experience two in our lifetime. The best resource for learning about this cycle is Richard Tarnas's book, Cosmos and Psyche, where he devotes several chapters to it. Tarnas, a professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, reviews the historical correlates to astrological phenomenon over several hundred years. Here's a quotation from Cosmos and Psyche, which was published in 2006. Quote, "The successive quadrature alignments, and by that he means the hard aspects, which are conjunctions, squares, and oppositions, of the Saturn-Pluto cycle coincided with especially challenging historical periods, marked by a pervasive quality of intense contraction. Eras of international crisis and conflict, empowerment of reactionary forces and totalitarian impulses, organized violence and oppression, all sometimes marked by lasting traumatic effects. An atmosphere of gravity and tension tended to accompany these 3 to 4 year periods, as did a widespread sense of epochal closure, the end of an era, the end of innocence, the destruction of an earlier mode of life. Profound transformation was a dominant theme, but the transformation was through contraction, conservative reaction, crisis, and termination." Contraction is certainly a watchword of what we're going through right now. Businesses are contracting, except Amazon, of course, is monopolizing. People's lives have been contracting with stay-at-home orders. Markets have been contracting as well. In terms of timing, there are a few stages of this transit. The first level of this transit happens when Saturn begins to enter a wide orb with Pluto. Tarnas says you should allow an orb of 15 degrees for events to start up, and that would have happened when Saturn was in the early degrees of Capricorn, so January, February of 2018. Then the next stage of the transit happens when the orb gets a lot tighter. I would personally use a little over 4 degrees, but every astrologer might do something different. So using about 4 degrees until exact, things would have really started heating up at the tail end of November 2019. This may have coincided with the first coronavirus case in China. Then there's the actual conjunction, which happened in January of this year in 22 degrees Capricorn. That's when news of coronavirus was first released because China published its genetic data for the rest of the world. It's also when tensions escalated between the US and Iran after our government assassinated one of Iran's top generals. I'm also a bit curious if more developments between these countries unfold throughout the second half of this year and into the next. 4 degrees past the exact conjunction brings us into February 2020, when the world began to grasp the gravity of the situation. In astrology, a degree that is made by a transit like the Saturn-Pluto conjunction remains active for a while. The point where the conjunction happened was in Capricorn of 22 degrees. So that degree is going to be kind of intense energetically. It can be triggered by hard transits from Mars, which are conjunctions, squares, and oppositions. Whenever Mars triggers this active degree, it means that the seeds planted during the conjunction reach the next phase of critical development. So the next stage of the Saturn-Pluto transit was when 22 degrees Capricorn was triggered by Mars, which entered that degree. Jupiter was also in there, and Mars entered that active degree around March 20th of 2020, and that was when California ordered the first shelter in place, which set the stage for many urban areas across the country. Another major astrological event is coming up next month, the June 21st eclipse. I've also heard about this eclipse ever since I began studying astrology. Eclipses are always a big deal, but this one's an even bigger deal because it's on a cardinal point. Cardinal points correlate with the initiation of the season. 0 degrees Aries is the beginning of spring. 0 degrees Cancer is the beginning of summer. 0 degrees Libra is fall, and 0 degrees Capricorn is winter. So in late June, there's a massive eclipse happening at a cardinal point, 0 degrees Cancer. Eclipses on cardinal points are rare. The last one was in June 2001, and then the one before that happened in 1889. The astrologer Celeste Teal devoted a whole chapter of her book Eclipses to this upcoming one. She said that the 1889 eclipse, along with the developing triggers from Mars over the following years, correlates with the Silver Panic, which plunged America into its worst financial depression at the time. Industries collapsed and banks closed their doors. Saturn and Pluto were also involved because they were square each other around then. A month before, the Sherman Antitrust Act was signed into law. That was the first federal act to outlaw monopolistic business practices. I look at the symbolism and its historical correlates, and I wonder whether the next couple of years will bring antitrust politics to the fore. How industries do business over the next few years is also going to transform dramatically as well. Things like corporate stockpiling policies and supply chain management may also be transformed dramatically. And perhaps this may bring more manufacture home. Money in agriculture will change too. In astrology, countries can also have birth charts. A commonly used birth chart for the United States is called the Sibley chart, which was cast at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. In the U.S. Sibley chart, this June eclipse is in our 8th house of other people's money, as well as death and rebirth cycle. So the United States 8th house in real-world terms can symbolize banks, the national debt, the IRS, the financial market, and also public health. So the degrees to pay attention to this year and the following couple of years are 22 degrees Capricorn and 0 degrees Cancer. Let's have a look at when Mars triggers these degrees. Both of these active degrees are in cardinal signs, which are Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. Mars enters 0 degrees Aries in the last week of June 2020, shortly following the eclipse. Then Mars enters 22 degrees Aries in the second week of August 2020. Then Mars goes retrograde on September 10th, so it's going to hit these degrees again because it's backtracking over its path. On a side note, between September 10th and 13th of this year, all of the outer planets are going to be retrograde. Retrograde means that the planet is moving backwards in the sky from our perspective on Earth. And times of planetary retrogradation are significant in astrology. They can be frustrating times because it means that a planet is going against the harmony of the entire ordered system. Delays, blocks, and frustrations may abound. It's probably not a good period for starting anything new. Then as Mars backtracks into the cardinal sign of Aries, it's going to hit 22 degrees again in the second week of October. Mars will go direct on November 14th and hit 22 degrees one last time between the second and third weeks of December. So for Mars's entire cycle in Aries, so that's June 29th to January 7th, 2021, Mars could be potentially triggering themes represented by the Saturn-Pluto conjunction as well as the upcoming June eclipse. The themes of economic upheaval, the transformation of financial institutions, antitrust politics, public health and safety, and governmental expansion and control may be highlighted. Even after Mars leaves Aries, Mars could still trigger the cardinal 0 and 22 degrees when it enters other cardinal signs. So around April and May 2021, Mars is going to be in Cancer. Then around September and October of 2021, Mars is going to be in Libra. And then around January and February of 2022, Mars is going to be in Capricorn. So these are some further long-range dates which may signal critical developments from the seeds planted during the Saturn-Pluto conjunction and June 21st eclipse. So we are all collectively dealing with some heavy astrological stuff. If you have anything in your chart in the last 2 degrees of a mutable sign, the first couple of degrees of a cardinal sign, or between 20 and 24 degrees of a cardinal sign, then these events might also affect you rather personally as well. The forces of history ebb and flow every century, bringing humanity times of cultural contraction and crisis, which are then followed by periods of cultural flowering, renewal, and peace. The average lifetime of 80 years will live through periods of both, and this is where we are in the grander cycle of things.